Let's see. Fucking Crowd says, could a brain hypothetically still function if you split the brain into 4 quarters, so 2 halves into halves, assuming you could do without permanent damage, like take a quarter out rather than half? Steph, I leave this up to you.
I don't think it could. I'm having trouble separating out the without doing any damage part because the brain is a vascular system, a electrical system, a chemical system, and a functional structural system. So it's hard to know how you would separate it into quarters, kind of like the body. Would the body still work if you separated it into 4 sections if you could do it without damage? Like, how would you?
Yeah, when you phrase questions like that, it's like, what do you mean? How would you
Without,
separate a body
right,
without damaging it?
exactly. Could you somehow prevent parts of the brain from talking to each other? Yes, absolutely. The split brain is one way, and they're cutting white matter fibers. But there are some other ways that they do it. In mice, they do it optogenetically. They use lights to turn off and on neural circuits that have been genetically engineered to respond to light. In humans, they do it with transcranial magnetic stimulation. They put a huge magnet next to the brain and it turns
They did that to
things on and off. I did it to you.
That was
exactly.
one of the attempts at curing depression, was TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Exactly. There are disconnection syndromes where parts of the brain are connected by white matter that never developed in the person. There are seizure disorders, which can cut off electrical signals being sent from one part of the brain to the other. And obviously, some of these things damage the brain a lot, and some of them damage the brain surprisingly not at all. And we often can't even really predict very well yet which things
will damage and which ones
will cause. Yeah, exactly.
Doxy says, yeah, so go ahead.
Like
sorry.
Case studies of people who were missing huge structures of the brain and missing their cerebellum.
There's the guy, the railroad guy.
Yeah. Sure, Phineas Gage.
Phineas Gage, yes.
Who had a tamping rod just go through a big old portion of his frontal lobe.
Let's show a picture of Phineas Gage for people who don't understand exactly what we're talking about. This guy. He was like working on the railroad and there was dynamite and the dynamite exploded and it sent like a metal rod through his skull.
A huge 6 foot long. That's him holding the metal rod went through his skull. It's not like a small thing. And you can see he lost an eye.
And he survived.
And it went through his jaw. And he survived. And in some of the versions of the story, we don't really know because there weren't neuropsychologists back then. And he was in Vermont where there's still not any people.
Where there's still not any neuropsychologists to this day.
Exactly. And so we don't really know. But in some versions of the story, he was pretty much the same. Other versions say his personality changed, but he eventually moved to South America and lived out his life as a taxi driver. And at that time, taxis were horse-drawn. But he, lived out his life.
Yeah,
missing a big old of his brain.
Seem like cognitively impaired or anything like that. It's fine. He lives his life surviving just like anybody else, it seemed.
Yeah.
Even though, like
a chunk of his brain is gone. Some of the versions of the story, he was different personality-wise. Yeah. But, the brain still worked. It's freaking weird. Or there's, people who are born without huge structures of their brain or with huge amounts of excess fluid in the fluid-filled sacs of their brain, and it squishes the rest of their brain. My cousin just recently had a tumor removed from her brain, and it was, the size of a golf ball. And it pushed everything else around, and it caused some problems, but not nearly as many as you might think. It was noticed because she went to an eye doctor because she was having trouble reading. And the eye doctor was like, "What do you mean?" And it looked odd. And they sent her to the hospital and they looked in her brain and, there was a tennis ball sized tumor in there.
It's pretty crazy.
But could you separate it out by lobes? lobes is probably not a very like that's a old we're discovering as we learn more about the brain that lobes is probably not a great way that we've been thinking about the brain, and it probably doesn't function in lobes as much as we previously thought. So it probably wouldn't work to be like separate the parietal from the temporal from the occipital kind of thing.
But actually says half splitting is just few nerves, right? There's an obvious way to cut it, but cutting in force is less obvious.
Yes. There's a big white matter tract called the internal capsule, basically, and you can just sever it with like a spoon. So yes, there are a few other commissures. So when you split the brain in half, you're not perfectly splitting it. There's a few other ways that it connects. Neb was kind of talking about when you show something to the left and right side of the brain, the visual fields don't split perfectly, and like the cerebellum is not cross-wired and the hemispheres are. So it's very slightly tricky, but basically there's this big old bundle of connecting fibers that go from the left to the right hemisphere in this huge thing that looks kind of like the underside of a mushroom. And the same way you could just cut a mushroom with a butter knife, cut the gill part of it, or cut it in half or whatever, you can just slice that white matter and essentially separate the two hemispheres from each other.
Okay, so
the cytoarchitecture of the lobes is a lot more complicated, which is why, like,
I don't
we're
even
finding
know
out that
what that word means. So, cytoarchitecture.
Yeah, the anatomy, the stuff that the
Stuff.
that
I know
we
that word.
okay. So when you look at the brain really closely in a microscope, some of it looks different. Some parts of it look different than other parts, and that's called the cytoarchitecture. Like, oh, this part has a bunch of like kind of little black specks in it, and this part is more smooth, and this part it has 6 layers instead of 5 layers, that sort of thing. And we use that cytoarchitecture, those signatures of the stuff that those parts of the brain are made of, to divide it into sections. And we're finding out that that probably wasn't sophisticated enough to really explain how the brain works. It's sort of like, let's say you have a car and you open it up and you kind of say like, oh, all these bits are made of shiny metal and all these bits are made of metal that isn't shiny. I'm going to divide up shiny from non-shiny and call them, one lobe and the other lobe of the car. And it's like, probably not. Even if you say like, oh, but these ones are really close together and these ones aren't really close together. And so these ones are all shiny and close together. I'm going to call it that. Really, you're much better off knowing about the car's exhaust system and its acceleration system and its brake system, even though those systems might be metal that's shiny and non-shiny and metal that's close together and not close together. That's a better way to think about a car. The brain, it turns out, is the same, that by just looking for close together shiny bits and close together non-shiny bits was not a very good way to understand how the brain works.